Albert, prometiste que volvías a hacer aventura conmigo y encima en León y has venido.
Me lo pasé bien, tengo que volver. No me podía quedar en casa.
Nada más empezar, ya estoy feliz.
¿Sí?
Y me hiciste caso. Mira qué colorín que has metido, que te veo la camiseta por fuera, el forro amarillo así. Tú mira cómo vamos de guapines.
Elegante.
Well, I think if you look at the growing consumer awareness and the progressive environmental and social government policies and legislations that are coming into place nowadays, everything's pointing towards us having solid change that's really here to stay. And I think in order for us to have a safe and healthy environment for people and the planet, it's necessary to shift towards what we would call circularity. So within sustainability, you have the term circularity, which is essentially trying to reuse resources as much as possible within the system that we have. And we need to do this because we're approaching the limit of our natural resources. So when we think, could fashion ever be 100% sustainable? There's lots that still needs to be done, and change needs to happen all across the supply chain for a more sustainable future. So thinking about designing products that are designed to be recycled or to be resold or rented multiple times, thinking about designing for longevity where that makes sense, using materials that are made from recycled textiles or from waste feedstocks like agricultural waste or methane gas, and implementing more sustainable processing methods. So we talk a lot about materials, but actually how the materials then turn into the final garments, how they're pre-treated, dyed and finished, has a huge impact. And there's lots of innovation opportunities in the dyes that we use or the finishing that we use and the way that those chemistries are applied to the fabric. And if we think a little bit outside the box, we also have things like digital transformation. So how can you use 3D design, digital showrooms, and even create a digital only world where your products, you could wear the different garments that you bought within this digital world. So all of these things could enhance the consumer and customer experience whilst also reducing resource consumption as well. So I think, could fashion ever be 100% sustainable? Depends how you define sustainable. But I think if we think through our lens and we think around circularity, then I think, yes, there's lots of exciting opportunities to help us get there. That's very difficult to think how many years would it take. I think that really depends on bringing together all of the different actors that are needed to make this change happen. So you've got the brands, the investors, manufacturers, innovators, consumers, but also policymakers. And I think it's a little bit of a carrot and a stick situation. So we see that it really makes business sense for brands to invest in innovation and sustainability. It helps them to future-proof their business, and it's also what the consumers are asking for. But sometimes you need a little bit of help from that stick, which is where policy and regulation comes in to help accelerate that path towards getting there. So obviously, when we talk about sustainability, as I said before, we're talking about circularity. So how can we close the loop as much as possible? And I think one way to be able to concretely make this happen is for brands to make and then track their progress against those commitments. So I think it's fabulous to see how many brands and manufacturers have set ambitious targets to reduce their impact by 2030. But in order to achieve those targets, they can't do it by themselves. And that's where we really need to work collectively together, and where organizations such as Fashion for Good come in to bring together those different actors to accelerate that change to make it happen at a faster rate. Well, we view sustainability under this framework of a circular system, and that system would be restorative and regenerative by design. So for true good fashion and a circular supply chain to exist, we need to think about design all the way through to end of use. So when you're designing a product, what materials are you using? What do you envisage that product will be used for and how many times? So you could design a product knowing that it is going to be recycled, or you could design a product knowing that you want it to be rented multiple times. So it really needs to be durable and to last. And that's also where you need collaboration, not only across the industry, but also within an organization. So it's about educating the designers, the product development teams, merchandising. So for us, actually, for a company to be truly sustainable, sustainability should be embedded across the whole organization. I would hope at some time in the future, sustainability almost becomes like an obsolete part of the organization because it's so within the DNA of what everybody is doing. And that's where it really trickles down from the top. So you can set like KPIs, goals, and metrics that everybody is tracking towards the same thing. So what does being sustainable mean? I think it means, really harnessing and embracing all aspects of everything that I just discussed across all parts of the business in order to really make that change happen. I think it really depends what frame you're looking through. So if we think about carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, then AII and WRI released a report last year that looked at the carbon impact in the different tiers of the fashion supply chain. So tier 4 is raw material extraction, and then it goes up to tier 1, which is essentially how the garments are made. And I think what was really interesting from that report is that actually the biggest impact from a carbon emission perspective is really in the materials and processing stage of the supply chain. So in terms of footprint reduction, that's where there's lots of opportunity. And I talked about that a little bit at the start. You know, could you actually have innovations in the way the fabrics are processed and produced, as well as from what they're made from? So if you think about greenhouse gas emissions and carbon impact, then it's really about improving the supply chain process. But obviously, you also need to think about a lot of the waste that ends up in landfill. And that's where actually we need to build a better infrastructure and ecosystem to be able to recapture the garments that are currently ending up in landfill, have a better sorting infrastructure to sort those garments, and then scale recycling technologies that could take those garments and that have no longer being used and recycle them. So I think that's also where we see a lot of opportunities and where we come into play with our projects. We have a few projects going on in the realm of end of use. There are 2 sister projects, one in Europe and one in India, that are basically mapping the textile waste in those regions with the aim that we'll basically be able to understand like what material is available. And then in the future, how could we actually partner up some of those recycling technologies with the waste that is already there? And then in the processing and material side, we have a project that looks at using agricultural waste to make fibers and fabrics. And then one in processing that basically looks to combine those different innovations together to have the biggest impact. So I think it's really about like not focusing on just one area, because then you lose sight of the whole. And that's really what we want to do at Fashion for Good, because we look at innovations across the whole supply chain and understand how holistically they can work together and not scale something that might have potential unintended consequences as it scales. I think, again, it depends what you mean by backup. Do we mean financing? Do we mean that we need the brand buy-in? Is it that we need manufacturers to take up those technologies? I'd argue a little bit of all of those things, really, to make them scale. And where startups really benefit is from support from experienced technical partners, because actually a startup can't address everything themselves at once. And that's where at Fashion for Good, we try and do that, bring together brands and manufacturers to help those innovators through their technical development process and enable them to iterate and accelerate how their innovation could work within the main supply chain. But then obviously you need the financing as well. So we wrote a report with AII back end of last year that looked at what is needed to finance the transition towards net zero. And I think what was really interesting in the report was that part of the solutions will come from innovations such as the ones that I work on at Fashion for Good. But part of it can also come from incremental innovations that already exist and that are out there. So there is a future for these fashion startups. We can already see them moving into the scale-up phase. Today, Spinova and Adidas released a hoodie that you can now buy as the everyday customer, which is just so exciting to see. I've been working with them both for a number of years, and so proud for them that that's now in the market. So yeah, it really takes time, commitment, and collaboration from all of those different stakeholders that we talked about before to enable those startups to scale, which we're starting to see with some of these longer term commitments that have been announced. So we actually have catalyzed 600 million capital towards funding innovators, scaling those solutions and driving the transformation. We do invest into some of the innovators ourselves, but these are smaller direct equity investments. So actually through our program, what we do is also help the innovators to connect them to external investors, basically to help them also through their funding round. So this space is an investment opportunity in itself, and brands and other stakeholders are committed to building greater insights into what's happening in their value chains, but they need new technologies and software platforms to do that. So at Fashion for Good, we see there's many promising innovations, particularly in the space around transparency and traceability, that will basically enable us to have greater traceability throughout the whole supply chain. And we're seeing that more innovations are emerging in response to the sustainability pressures that are coming because of the unprecedented situation that the world now finds itself in as well. But really, when it comes down to it, there's no single stakeholder who can do this by themselves. So it's really about bringing together all of those different actors, as I said before. You have the orchestrators, that might be an organization like Fashion for Good. You have the brands, they really need to really advocate for the innovators and provide hands-on support. Some of the brands we work with also invest into the innovators that are in our program. For example, Bestseller have invested into some of the innovators, Adidas as well, Zalando, which is super exciting to see. Then you also need the supply chain partners who are have engagement and ownership as well, because you can't scale these solutions if you just have the innovators and the brands. You need all of those different stakeholders along the way. So I think that essentially what we need is, as we said, a lot of financing needs to be unlocked. The AII Fashion for Good report put a number of 1 trillion to help us get there. And really, it's critical for all of these different stakeholders to work together to create an environment where investors are presented with projects and opportunities that are, 1, attractive from a risk return perspective, 2, impactful from an environmental and social perspective, and 3, understandable for funders not ultimately familiar with the industry. So what we need to do is essentially validate these technologies to also through the actual projects and pilots, but also through that brand pool to attract external financing to help them be able to scale. I always think that you need big ships and little ships if we're going to make change happen. So little ships are much more agile, they can move much faster, but the big ships might take more time to turn, but they have a bigger impact. And so I think it's really comes back to each of those different brands or manufacturing players really identifying where they can have the biggest impact, and then focusing on scaling innovations and solutions in those spaces. So if you're a sportswear brand and you use a lot of synthetic fibers just because that's what's needed, right, for the sort of products that are coming out, looking for solutions that could replace virgin synthetic fibers. And if you're one of the luxury players, it might be looking more for innovations in silk or wool or different fibers like that. So I think all of them need to be playing their role to lead the change, and each of them has a different role to play in that puzzle. sustainability will have become the norm. I think I alluded it to at the start. Hopefully you don't even need a sustainability team because it's such an embedded part of the company's DNA. And then I think it's where, could you think of a future where your clothes are digital, where your avatar in this digital only world wears the latest Adidas drop, or where you rent your clothes for the weekend away or a work trip, or once you've finished with a garment, you can either resell it via the brand's platform or send it to be recycled. Or a future where your clothes are made from agricultural waste, from algae or recycled textiles that have been dyed using black pigment made from wood waste. So I think, what will the sector look like? For me, hopefully a lot of these solutions that we're working with will be like commercially available. And there will also have been a mindset shift within corporate companies and also with the consumers, where it's normal for people to be renting and reselling their clothes at a much bigger scale than they are now. So I think the last years have shown that circularity, sustainability, and innovation are key drivers for economic success. And the companies that keep going from strength to strength are the ones that have integrated circularity across all aspects of their business, where marketing, product development, supply chain, and design teams are also on that journey. And it is a journey. Circularity is going to take time. It's a big investment that demands patience. But change will happen collectively, and it requires multiple stakeholders, including all of those different ones we talked about earlier, to be part of that process. I think the elephant in the room is still overproduction. And the pandemic highlighted more than ever the challenges that faced when supply chains are disrupted and products can't be sold. But what we have seen coming out of the pandemic is an increase in circular business models, such as re-commerce and rental, the growth of platforms like ThreadUp, Depop, and Vinted, as people engage in purchasing clothes in a new and different way. And we also see that brands have a strong commercial opportunity to tap into this market. It enables them to decouple their commercial growth from material production by effectively reusing products that they already have. I think the other thing is that the pandemic also accelerated digital transformation across the supply chain. So I talked before about 3D design, sampling, digital showrooms. All of these things had to be put in place because the status quo was no longer possible. So I think in the last 5 years, I think the big things that have changed is it's really become much more part of the narrative that brands really want to actually work concretely with these different innovators to scale up their solutions. And then on the consumer-facing side, our museum that showcases all of the different innovations that we're working with. And I think it's fabulous to also see how much interest there is in the people who visit the museum or do the digital tours or the masterclasses or the workshops, where actually it's becoming much more commonplace for people to actually want to learn how their clothes are made, where their clothes were made, and basically where the things that they're buying are coming from, which is super exciting to see.
Albert, prometiste que volvías a hacer aventura conmigo y encima en León y has venido.
Me lo pasé bien, tengo que volver. No me podía quedar en casa.
Nada más empezar, ya estoy feliz.
¿Sí?
Me hiciste caso. Mira qué colorín que has metido, que te veo la camiseta por fuera, el forro amarillo así. Tú mira cómo vamos de guapines.
Elegante.